So this last week, I'm always interested in what the Tao is telling me. Um, Someone who sits with us, we were having a conversation, a few of us, about the Tao being at work or not. And she said, I don't know, the Tao is always busy if you pay attention. And it's true, things are always moving. And so I often find one of the elements of my own practice is just trying to listen, almost like putting my ear to the ground or the track, or I don't know, elephants listen with their toes. Apparently, they can move their toes down, and when they put them on the earth like this, they can hear very far. I'm not an elephant, but I try to listen anyway, with my toes and my ears and my being. And almost every single person I talked to this week had some version of the question, am I doing it enough? Am I going deep enough? Should I be doing deeper? Am I not getting the koans? Is it bad that I don't come to the temple every morning? Yes, is the answer. If just in case you were wondering. But is it bad that I don't have any clue what the koans mean that are going out on the list? Is it bad that I'm going on vacation? How do I get deeper? Is it bad that something conflicts with sesshin? Um, almost every person I talked to had some version. So I thought, well, this must have just something to do with what's going on right now. And I don't know if I have a theory as to why, but I think part of what it got me thinking about is that in some way what the root of that question is, because there isn't really a right answer. I mean, you can probably find things that'll give you a right answer. Only if you sit every day for 20 minutes will you ever get enlightened. Only if you ever, you will find things like that. But for our purposes, the more interesting, alive part of that question, for me at least, is how much does this matter to me? Am I really in accord with my own deeper life in some way? Because it feels like these inflection points of practice happen. And my own experience is that they're often a symptom of something ready to let go or go deeper. And all sorts of things start to appear as blocks. Or that some part of us knows that we're holding on to something that's not actually serving our deeper life. And that we start to come up with lots of explanations and justifications for why that's actually important and we can't give it up. And you might feel compelled to say that to people you practice with, or your teacher, or yourself, or your spouse, or something. But actually, that part doesn't matter at all. You can convince your teacher of all the things, but you're the one who actually is the most invested in how any of this goes. And in a way, you're the only one who knows if you're on the track that you want to be on. A teacher and a community can be pretty good of knocking you off delusions and things like that. But what really keeps you showing up day after day after day is some kind of fire, some kind of flame, some kind of longing in your own being for whatever it is that these teachings bring alive. And I guess in some way, the mind really likes to have a theory or a vantage point. How's it going? There's some great koans about, there's one about a guy who was teaching all summer, and he says to the congregation, he asks about his eyebrows, because the thing is, if you still have eyebrows, you're not doing so well as a teacher. And they say, oh, the thief has a guilty heart. It's just that sense of, how am I doing? Is this going well? Is this worthwhile? Is this It's very hard to tell. You may have noticed. Sometimes when you're in the absolute deepest despair, the next day is when some bright piece of wisdom appears in your mind. And sometimes when you actually think you've got it all handled and it's going well, you end up in the pit of despair. And so that mind that likes to somehow have a theory or a vantage point gets just thwarted over and over and over and over again. And that actually is the long arc of practice, to see that thwarting over and over and over and over again. And our particular school of awakening, there are two different paths that got described as one that believed more in gradual awakening, and you really did have to do it over time, and one which is more our wheelhouse that thinks at any moment something can break open for you. And that's true. And there's often this long arc of integration that's part of why we work with myths and fairy tales, and part of why there are the images like Dongshan's 5 ranks or the ox herding pictures that have the 10 stages. You can't really monkey with which stage you're at in a definitive way, but it starts to show you, is there something you're leaving out? Is there a sacrifice you're not willing to make? Is there some idea of yourself or your life that you're holding on to? And those images become quite helpful in wherever we might get stuck. And something else I've noticed recently, or at least I've been thinking about quite a bit recently, is oftentimes as your practice deepens, you'll start to get a sense of freedom and things will start to go a little bit easier. And somehow in the field of that, what happens next is you realize, I don't know, that your house is falling down, or that your marriage is in shambles, or that you have a dream that's incredibly disturbing, or you start fighting with everyone you know, or and Marie-Louise von Franz had this great way of describing that, which is something in us is very wise and knows at any given time what we're ready for. And that as we start to build a little bit of ground, psychic ground, by which we can actually tolerate more difficult things to face, more difficult things that we may have ignored or not been ready to look at or tolerate. They get delivered like little Amazon packages to your door. And at some point you might open up and you have way more packages than you would like that particular day. Something has decided that you're ready for that material. And not to take that as a failure, that, this practice was going so well and now I have this pile of shit on my doorstep, I must be doing something wrong. That in fact, there's a readiness to begin to transform bigger, deeper, harder things. And we sort of know, it's no news in this tradition that there's no place to arrive. But I think I was listening to the nature writer, Robert McFarlane. He's a very just beautiful, wonderful mind and interesting person to listen to. Happened to be listening to an interview with him recently on it was kind of just an absolute nerding out about writing podcast, these two guys. But some of the things he was saying, I thought, this is part of what it means to really have the long arc of practice. Like he's been writing in the way he's writing, which is most of what he does, if you're not familiar with his work, is he picks something like a mountain or rivers or trees or underground places, and for a period of 5 or 10 years, he said most of his books take 4 to 8 years to write, which is a pretty long arc. If you're a creative person, that takes some staying power in your psyche. He just immerses himself in the phenomena of that thing. And he started, his greatest teachers at the beginning of his life were the company of mountains. And he would just realize, what does that do to him to be in the company of mountains? And at some point, he decided he really wanted to immerse himself in the nature of river. And he's talking to his little boy, and he says, "Do you think rivers are alive?" This is the question that's animating his book. This is kind of the koan that he's carrying for a good while. His little boy says, "Well, duh. Of course, that's not going to be a very long book." And he said for 300 pages, he carried this question, and for years and years, and he took himself, the first sentence of this particular book is something like 12,000 years ago, a river was born. And that kind of becomes his koan. And he spends sometimes hundreds of iterations. The way his particular practice works, he was describing, he'll take hundreds of iterations at the first sentence, because he's realized if he somehow gets the first sentence resonant, that everything will flow from there. And that as he's going through his immersion, he has tons of little notebooks that he's just writing things. And part of what he realizes is that at night, when he sits down, just sort of his dedicated practice to just see, he realizes all these thoughts that he had and all these things he noticed that he wasn't conscious of. And in a way, each time we sit down for a practice, that's what we're doing. There's a notebook somewhere in our heart that we're noticing the things we notice. We're taking note of what may have slipped by or seemed less important. And these collections of things is what come to then inform these books. But the other thing he said was that after the 300 pages, when he'd finally written this book, he had way more questions than he started with. And so the mystery, instead of getting answered, just spread and spread and spread and spread, which I think is part of that long arc of practice. That I go through phases of thinking I know what this is, or thinking I know what this person is, or the world is, or mind is, or anything is. And if I'm really willing to to stay in that, to stay in the fire of that, and not just think, well, I got it, or well, there's not too much more here, or well, it will just keep opening. The mystery spreads. And he teaches at Cambridge, and the thing he tells his students more than anything else about how they write is ass in the chair. That's his first and only piece of advice, ass in the chair. If you can just do that, and if you can just keep bringing your sense of curiosity and wonder to prepositions, to punctuation, he started noticing when he was writing about water that his sentences were getting longer and more unwieldy because they were just starting to flow, and punctuation just got less and less interesting. And he thought, oh, it's happening. And that he had a sentence that went on for 2 pages. And he thought, oh, that's part of what it's like to keep the company of water, and to somehow, he was describing beginning to partner with the elements. In a sense, Sense that's what we're doing. We're partnering. When you take up a koan, your consciousness and its consciousness start to partner on something, partner on this project of awakening. And if you take it up sincerely, something will just start to change. Your questions will change. Your adherence to punctuation might change. And I'm going to read you maybe just give you a little flavor of his mind, because he does other things. You can tell like nourishing his practice is very important to him. He'll do things like for 3 years he collected weird words. That was his practice. And or he'll just start switching out prepositions to see what happens to his mind. Instead of he'll just start inserting with everything. You see, oh, if I'm with everything all the time, what happens to me? This is kind of about practice itself, really. I think what brings us to this particular Dharma and practice. He says, paths are the habits of a landscape. Kind of like neural pathways almost, you can tell, but paths are the habits of a landscape. They are acts of consensual making. It's hard to create a footpath on your own. Paths connect. This is their first duty and their chief reason for being. They relate places in a literal sense, and by extension, they relate people. Paths are consensual too, because without common care and common practice, they disappear. Feels an awful lot like the Dharma to me. Common care and common practice. Without those things, they disappear, overgrown by vegetation, plowed up or built over, though they may persist in the memorious substance of land law. Like sea channels, they require regular dredging to stay open. Paths need walking. I feel like this is sort of what we do. Every time you sit down, you bring yourself to the path. You're always on it, which the ancestors really like to point out. You can't actually fall off it if you try, but there's something about bringing yourself to the path over and over. And he says, this one, the other thing I noticed about him, and this is true of anything, and having a real practice, whether it's painting or writing, or if you bring yourself deep enough to it, you follow it all the way down, you'll just learn something about the nature of life itself. He says, those who travel to mountaintops are half in love with themselves and half in love with oblivion. I thought, oh yeah, that's about where it's part of what brings us to this. We love our own being somewhere enough. It's not usually what brings us, but that's part of what gets revealed. What brings us is we think we disdain our own being at some level and we're longing for oblivion. But actually, there's some deep longing to witness and honor our own Buddha nature. Somehow we know it's here. And even to catch a glimpse of it, usually people start to, tears come. When I realize, oh, that oblivion is actually this. He says, for deep time is measured in units that humble the human instant. Millennia, epochs, and eons. Instead of minutes, months, and years, deep time is kept by rock, ice, seabed sediments, and the drift of tectonic plates. Seen in deep time, things come alive that seemed inert. New responsibilities declare themselves. Ice breathes. Rock has tides, mountains rise and fall. We live on a restless earth. And I'll give you just a little taste of him because you can feel what starts to happen when you give yourself fully to something. It doesn't actually even matter what it is. Your practice could be chopping vegetables. But if you put the entirety of your being in, you start to notice things about the mysteries, about the principles, the fundamental reality bits of what it is to really be alive. Somehow he's got a taste for that. And the koan I mentioned, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the Fourth Ancestor. We don't speak about him very much. Dao Xin was his name. And part of why he's interesting in this territory was that he was the first one, Bodhidharma sort of was a wildfire for talking about flames. He just sort of blew himself round and enveloped an entire generation of seekers into something possible. And then there were a couple disciples after him. But by the time we get to Dao Xin, he kind of realized if this Chan thing is going to survive, it's going to have some stability and some roots. And so he started integrating with some of the other Buddhist practices of the time, and he started doing a very heretical thing, which was having monks farm so that they could have their own temple, which doesn't seem very heretical, but in a lot of the traditional ideas about Buddhism still at that time, the precepts meant you literally did not kill. And so plowing and doing things to the earth where you might squish insects and things like that was actually this revolutionary, innovative thing. But it allowed them to begin to have their own temples and to begin to, broaden his mind so that other Buddhist people might be interested in the ideas, actually started to acclimate Chan to the wider world. And just to give you a flavor of him, he's a kind of interesting person. Apparently there was a city, this was before he had completely set up his temple, there was a city under siege for like 70 days. Sounds like one of the stories in the Grail myths. And everyone was terrified and didn't know what to do. And his answer was to teach all the people inside the wall how to chant the Heart Sutra, or a version of the Heart Sutra. And he got them chanting so loud and so much that the bandits started to hallucinate phantom soldiers and thought, we don't want to mess with these people. This seems like a bad idea. And he ended the siege. And this is interesting for a couple reasons. You never know what might help. It's not always what you think, but also in that same vein that when you commit yourself fully to something, you move into the territory fully, unexpected things begin to open. And this is undoubtedly true. This is the one thing I have seen more than anything else. If you commit fully to the territory, things will begin to change in your world. And may not be easy things to change. You may start to see things about relationships or the way you have your life set up or the way you avoid things or the way you run away from things or, I'm not saying it comes with, that it's all kittens and rainbows, but you start to see what's really important and the tension that you hold in your being around those things that usually you think this must just be what it's like to be me, but in fact it's you doing this or it's you doing this. As that starts to ease when you face things, man, life just does. The bandits give up. That's what I'll say. The bandits give up the siege. Anyway, one day, Dao Xin is sitting and he gets a message. He gets some kind of celestial message that he realizes there's a monk he needs to go talk to. And so he makes his way over to a neighboring mountain temple, and he says to them, do you have a monk here? And they said, well, I don't know. Everybody's a monk here. Everybody who's left home. What do you mean? And then he said, no, I'm looking for a real monk. And they said, oh, we think you want the guy in the hermitage over there, So he goes and finds Fa Long. And at this time, one of the stories that goes with Fa Long is that when he sat, birds would come make offerings of flowers in their beaks. 100 birds would come and make an offering of flowers in their beaks to him. But when Dao Xin reaches him, he's not so impressed by this, which I think is actually good news, that he's not impressed by this. This is the opening that comes. I just want to share with you a little bit of their exchange. That's what fosters our koan eventually. So Fa Long is sitting, and he's upright in meditation, but he's completely self-absorbed. The world around him has completely ceased to exist. And Dao Xin asks him, what are you doing? He said, perceiving mind. Very earnest answer. And Dao Xin says to him, well, who is it who is perceiving mind? And what is mind? And all of a sudden, Farong has no answer. And so a little bit like Deshan and the tea lady. He realizes, I've come a certain way, but I haven't quite reached something. So he stands up and he bows. And he says, where does your worthiness reside? And he says, Da Xin says, this monk has no permanent home. Sometimes I'm here, sometimes I'm there. He said, well, perhaps you know the master Dao Xin. And he says, well, what would you ask him? He says, well, I've just heard of him. I'd like to pay my respects. He says, well, in fact, that's me. And he says, well, is there someplace we can talk? And the exchange goes on, but because Farong lives in this place that's, completely away from the world and all with the wild beasts, at a certain point, Dao Xin gets, whether he's pretending or not, gets frightened of the tigers and the bears that are roaring and prowling about. And Farong says to him, are you still like this? So such a, bro, are you still scared of tigers in the phenomenal world? Like, come on. And he says, what is this? So what's so interesting about this exchange is you can tell Farong thinks he's made it. He has some idea that because he's, the birds bring him flowers in their beaks, and he can, in his own mind, be completely impervious to the outside world, that's it. And you can tell Dao Xin is sort of like, clearly you've got something going on here because the heavens are bringing me your way. And this is true in your own practice, that you will reach places that things will start to take notice. The Tao will start to take notice. You don't have to worry too much about convincing anyone of where you are or where you aren't. The heavens actually start to take care of it by themselves. But Dao Xin basically can see there's something he doesn't quite get yet. And so when he gets up, I don't know, to go pee or go get some tea or something, Dao Xin writes the character Buddha on his seat. And when Farong comes back, he's very disturbed by this. And Dao Xin says to him, are you still like this? And what happens next, Farang realizes there's something he doesn't quite get. And so a new layer of conversation opens up around them. And it's an exchange worth looking up. But the gist of it, I'm going to give you just a little bit of it. The gist of it is that he still somehow sees Buddha as something outside, doesn't realize it's everything. So he's still reaching and holding for something. And Daoxin says to him, when there's not a single teaching left, you're just left to abide in your own nature, with no need to worry about your behavior, no need to practice cleansing austerities, just living a life without desire, with a mind without anger, without cares, completely at ease and without impediment, acting accordingly to your own will without needing to take on any good or evil affairs. Just walking, abiding, sitting, and lying down, with whatever meets your eye being nothing other than the source. All of it is the sublime function of Buddha, blissful and without care. This is called Buddha. And somehow this opens something in Farang. And it's a little bit our moment of the moth in the flames swallowing the tiger, that rather than reaching, rather than pressing, rather than all the things that we do to not be at ease, he gets it. And I guess the last thing I want to say before and then we'll just sit for a little bit, is that this is nothing we can rush. It's this very interesting line in practice between, we rush anyway, and we strive anyway, and that actually can help. So you can't not strive. It's a great thing about don't think delusive thoughts. If you think delusive thoughts, don't get rid of them. All this happens anyway, but that how practice comes to live at the center of your being isn't something you can force. Because if you try to force it, some part of you will end up rebelling against that. Or if you try to be overly virtuous, then some part will relish in the biting someone or getting away from that. Or you see, no matter what. But in the long arc, you kind of have to do all that to see that. And so in a way, we talk about it and we learn to just trust that wherever you are, you're on the road, and that if it really means something to you, it will keep unfolding if you keep yourself in the fire. Sometimes you leave the fire to realize you want to be in the fire. And. There's no way you leave the road. But it likes it when we make paths. Another thing in this territory that seems worth saying, so much of this pivotal point, that swallowing the tiger, having been able to tolerate all the things you've been holding on to falling away. Swallowing the tiger is really in some way beginning to let the Dharma appear in you, in your own form, in your own voice, in your own being. And I was noticing during the meditation, particularly in listening to Michael and thinking about Robert McFarlane, that in no way is that inextricable from love. Meaning that there's so much that brings us to this, right? Usually it's curiosity or suffering or something, but unavoidably you run into the territory of love, meaning ways that you keep it out, or ways that you long for it, or ways that what you love just starts to be obvious to the people around you and becomes a kind of teaching. If you love beauty, or you love music, or Robert McFarlane was saying, this guy says to him, "So you like writing?" He says, "Well, I've come to like it." He said, "It's hard. It's very hard. But after a long enough practice, he can't imagine being without it. And what draws him to it is his love for the territory, for the words, for the act itself, for what it does to him, for what appears, for what, And no, just how there's one poem I sort of happened on that somehow is in this territory of what initially sparks our interest in the path and keeps us here is some form of love, however, however obscured by the desire for understanding. I think when I want understanding, I want to belong to the universe. I want to feel in accord with what's here, and that actually has something much to do with love. This is called Beginnings by a poet called Jacqueline Johnson. She says, "I did not expect to find a river so far inland. What underground tributary lake is your source? It goes on for miles into the center of an unending earth. Back then, everything was music. Wind running through rooster hair, scratchy weed, wild onion, wheat. Blue gingham skirt, long nappy braids, brown and red bone too. When they built the first pyramid, those Nubian Negroes did not sweat. They used music, ancient tones, hoot wails, song, prayers, and shouts that lifted earth into air. How did melody find you? Girl child, fingers banged upon ebony and pounced upon ivory keys. All around were concentric circles of arms and laps, family allowing and trusting who you were to just be. Everyone, parents, aunts, siblings, and cousins left the parlor room regularly to you, and those unseen hosts of treble clefs and jazz arias yet to be born. In some way, this is her coming in contact with practice, with source, with sangha, with something, with the way that whatever the deep thing is that starts to call to and want to come out of you. Let's see, there's somebody I really wanted to hear from. Let me see if I can find her. Christina. I wonder if you have anything to say about this.
Thank you, Tess. Oh, it's just been amazing to listen to you. I almost feel like I can't talk because I'm going to start crying just from listening to you. I'm not exactly sure what to say. I'm in the middle of teaching a class called Diving into Authenticity. It's a kind of developmental class for artists, and as I'm teaching it, I keep kind of jokingly thinking to myself that the real name of the class is Food and Nature for Artists. And so it's really what we're spending our time doing, is trying to clear the cobwebs from each person's psyche in terms of what they do. And it's been really quite amazing for me to be teaching it at this moment. It's been last time I taught this course was before COVID, and really before I really had a practice. And it's really remarkable how much the practice is now part of what I'm doing as I'm teaching. I'm constantly pulling from it. And yet at the same time, I don't really feel, I mean, I kind of don't even feel like I'm teaching because I feel like I'm really just creating the container. I can really feel that something is moving through me um, into the classroom, and that thing has created an amazing flow in the class between all the participants in the class. The sense of, we were talking about love, the sense of love that has been created between the 9 people that are in the class, and the way that they now have kind of, the way they're holding each other in relation to the practice is really incredibly touching. So that's not really an answer to what you were talking about, but um, yeah, I'm just really grateful for the practice. Thank you.
Thanks for carrying it forward. I wanted to pick on you because I know you're doing that this week, and I feel like one of the cool things about this community is people find very innovative ways to nest the koans into all these corners of their worlds, and that's part of that integration piece, which I think is pretty cool. We have dancers that make koan dances, we have artists, we have Christopher. I wonder if you have anything you'd like to say today.
Mm, Um, yeah, not quite sure what it is yet, but it's um, for me. What's showing up is that time is running again, and it the the reason I say that is, and again, I guess the image of a mouse running through, like a Disney thing of a mouse running through the inside of a clock, and all the gears and everything are shifting and turning, and pendulums are swinging, and things are going through. But to be anywhere else other than running that path and touching every little thing, not a thought goes through, yet everything shows up to carry every next step. And that's alive for me, I guess, at the moment, because in the process of cleaning up areas around the house and such, needed I'm getting a track got a tractor, I guess, and cleaning the garage, and time starting is, and this, I don't know, fire as it appears is going through and making room, and in the process of that, all noticing all of these things where time just stopped, previous projects left abandoned, just in place, the bike tools covered in spider webs, and all these things where it just, there was, I don't know, I don't even know when that happened, but in the process of making room and things just burning and things happening, and all of the stuff falling into place to just run, um noticing how those things, I don't know, just things get cleared, time feels like it's running again, and that activity of, I guess, the fire, where it's at.
Thank you, Christopher. There's also one of the things that comes to mind about Christopher is he told me recently all he knew was he needed to get a tractor. That was all. That was the one thing he knew. And everything else began to flow from there. And I think that's a real, as you say, time flows. But um, sometimes all you know is the most absurd thing that you can think of, and yet that's what's needed. Um, the other thing about the long arc, another bit I put in the flyer from the Wumen Guan, is that you realize no matter how well it's going or not, something has always been alive and awake in you. The verse says, because it's so very clear, it's hard to realize. Once you learn that a candle flame is fire, you'll discover your rice has long been cooked. You'll discover it's been here all this time. Thanks for being here, everybody. It's nice to touch that deep place together.